lead in terms of quality. The hardware is there, is the software there? And this is where I think the key question is to be asked, whether China will lead in the 21st century. What I find very extraordinary is that after a century of dislocation, a century of nation building, you have Chinese universities for the first time really in nearly a century taking the humanities seriously. Of course being strong in business, of course being strong as one must in science and engineering, but taking and first of all reintroducing for the first time in a serious way the humanities to an undergraduate education. When I was dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, we were reforming Harvard's undergraduate curriculum in part to re-emphasize the humanities as the core of liberal education. And I had a Chinese university president come to ask me, could they have Harvard's core curriculum? And I offered to sell it to them because I was getting rid of it. And they found out I was getting rid of it. They didn't want it anymore. They wanted the new one. And every one of our curricular reports was much more carefully read in Beijing than it was by my faculty colleagues at Harvard. There's an obsession with how one becomes a great university, how one becomes a leader in, how one trains leaders. You know, places like Duke and Harvard, we always say we train leaders. No, I've never heard of a university that says we train followers. But we actually mostly do train followers, but nevertheless, China wants to train leaders. It has trained over the 20th century a generation of engineers, and a generation of militarists and engineers, military schools and then engineering schools, as it were. And it now seeks something different. Wilhelm von Humboldt is read in Beijing more than he is in Berlin, the man who created the idea of a liberal education. And there's the sense that China ought to rise in the global rankings. Now, it's an interesting thing to pause on for a moment to think. The most important global ranking of universities today is a Chinese ranking. The Shanghai Jiao Tong University rankings are read by deans and presidents the world over. I was in Vienna last year. The president of the University of Vienna was furious that Vienna was only number 65 in the Shanghai Jiao Tong. He was taking it this seriously. I personally never take these rankings very seriously, or never took them seriously when I was dean, as long as Harvard was number one. Nevertheless, there's this obsession of being a world-class university, having universities that can train Nobel scholars, right? And of course, we should now congratulate China on its newest, but not its first, Nobel scholar. But in some sense, this is always a bit crazy. Nobel Prizes are often given in the sciences to people who have done their work 30 years ago at another university. And yet we all take credit. It's a bizarre way of what none of these rankings do is to matter what will really matter for China in the 21st century. What matters for Duke, what matters for Harvard, what matters for any great university. Not just research, not just what you can measure in terms of publications, but whom you can inspire. How you train and educate students. How you have communities of learning. How do you measure teaching and inspiration? And how do you have an education that is broadening rather than narrowing? How do you have an education that is a liberal education in the sense of liberating the individual? And what I find extremely positive about Chinese universities today is an introduction of, a reintroduction of a sense of the humanities. When you think of, back to that slide of the Qing examinations, in 1905 when that system, there was really no higher ideal for education anywhere in the world than in China in 1905. Good people reading great books in order to do good work in society. It wasn't sufficient for the challenges of the time. But the idea that the humanities in particular are going to be the key to the leadership of the future, this you see at the Yuanpei program at Beida. This you see at Fudan College, a liberal arts college in Fudan. This you see with experimentation, perhaps in terms of what Duke will do and what others will do in China in coming times. A big question to ask, with which I will nearly finish, is can you have great universities and liberal education in a politically illiberal society? I think it's as easy an answer as it sounds. German universities if the Shanghai Jiao Tong University rankings existed 100 years ago, Harvard would not be number 1. 8 of the top 10 universities in the world would be German universities. And today, not one of the top 50 is a German university. But these German universities were great even in a politically constrained. When one thinks about China's growth, Americans often think of it in the context of America's stagnation or America's decline. And I think it's worth contemplating that. If you think back about 100 years ago, the United States was selling clothes to China, textiles to China, and buying Chinese railway bonds. Railway bonds that would wallpaper many an American bathroom. So worthless would they become. And today we are buying everything from China, and China is buying American treasuries. And who knows to what decorative use these will be put in coming decades. But we used to say, when Chinese-American relations restarted, as it were, in the 1970s, that we were 同床异梦, that we had necessary common interests, but we were sleeping in the same bed with really different dreams, ideas of different mistresses, whatever, masters, or mistresses. We are now today, without question, embedded together in a global system of learning and teaching now from each other as never before, and sharing many, but not all, the same dreams. Thank you very much. The Ming. The Portuguese were in Macau for about 20 years before the Ming figured it out. They knew about it even. Then they became fanatically obsessed with containing the Portuguese in Macau, building the wall across the peninsula and the gate, and so that to keep them out. And Wills puts the question like this: how is it possible that the great Ming Empire, the most sophisticated, powerful, cultured empire on earth, is afraid, and he didn't put it quite this way, but of a bedraggled and syphilitic bunch of Europeans, which is what the Portuguese, in fact, were. And his answer was because they knew just how fragile their systems of control really were. And so, some people look at China today and say it's arrogant and strong, and that's why it's doing what it's doing with the Mr. Liu or in some other realms. And I think there's something to that. But arrogance and anxiety often go very closely together. And you see this enormous growth of public security apparatus, the enormous new public security bureau building right on Chang'an Jie, right at the heart of power, like in your face there. There is an enormous sense of worry. And because we have, a Chinese historian, that old famous phrase, you can conquer from horseback, but you can't rule from horseback. This is in some ways, so go back to my militarization theme, a regime that has yet to dismount. And it is yet to create an enduring, self-replicating system of civil governance, even with a strong center, that would be as strong and self-replicating as that which it purports to replace, that of the old empire. And so I worry, I think the big Achilles heel is the political fault of China. And sometimes I think of comparing PRC with Taiwan in this regard. Taiwan went, so in terms of engineers and leaders, Taiwan was run by engineers too. Military dictatorship at the top, engineers running the show on the bottom. Now it's run entirely by lawyers. Chen Shui-bian, Ma Ying-zhou. And I like Ma Ying-zhou, he's our Xiaoyou, he's our graduate. But what's interesting is the Kuomintang, the sister party of the Chinese Communist Party, had elections for 50 years. Never with the idea that they could lose. Elections are not meant to be lost. That's why they were so stunned in 2000. But they eventually erected a political system where they could lose power and regain it peacefully. Right now, when the CCP falls, it will be gone forever. And there is no, and that is the greatest danger, the lack of preparation for, not necessarily, you can have dominant party leadership, you can have a whole range of things, but the lack of accountability, the lack of honest court systems, the lack of honest police systems, the lack of a free press, those actually more important than electoral democracy are, I think, the biggest things to worry about.
Thank you. Yes, please.